This is PowerPoint Lecture 2.1 for Survey of Economics on Gross Domestic Product and Business Cycles. We now shift gears into macroeconomics, and you'll recall that microeconomics deals with the individual firm, consumer, and industry, whereas macroeconomics deals with the economy at large. And one of the larger issues we deal with is gross domestic product, and that's what we're starting with. And so in this PowerPoint, we'll look at gross domestic product and how it's counted. We'll look at the idea of the business cycle and how it works, wage price ratio and what it means and why it's important to the business cycles. And then we'll look at the two major negative consequences of business cycles, which is inflation and unemployment. First, we start with the definition of gross domestic product, which is simple enough to understand, but we want to take a good hard look at it, which is the total monetary value of all finished goods and services produced in a year. Now, what we notice from this is two things. First of all, no intermediate goods are counted in the gross domestic product. The reason for this, an intermediate good is any good or service that is used in the production of a finished good. And so, for example, labor is an intermediate good. Back to our restaurant example from microeconomics, all of the ingredients that go into food at a restaurant, they all count as intermediate goods. The reason they're not counted is to avoid double accounting, okay? Their value gets included in the overall value of the finished product, okay? So aluminum, steel, their value is included in the overall price of the car. Okay, the overall value of the automobile. And so, you know, with our fish sandwiches, the bun, the fish, the breading, all that, the breadcrumb, right, all that gets included in the overall value of the fish sandwich. Okay, and so we don't count labor. Okay, the cost of the labor is to produce the thing, and we don't count the intermediate goods or the other intermediate goods. And the second thing that's not counted here is no previously made goods. Okay, so if you go out and buy yourself a used car, that doesn't count to the gross domestic product. It doesn't count because it was already counted. Again, we're avoiding double accounting. We've already counted that in the year it was originally produced. So if you go out and buy a 2002 automobile, well, it was already counted in 2002. We're not going to count it again. And so if you go and buy a house, you know, that's already been purchased, it's already previously been owned, then it doesn't count for the gross domestic product. And it's to avoid double accounting. And now we'll deal with the major ways of counting GDP. And we'll get to this in a minute. There's two basic ways to do it. I stick with this one. I stick with this one because of Occam's razor. Occam's razor says that whenever you have two explanations of the same phenomenon, the simpler of the two explanations is to be preferred. And this is a simpler explanation. Okay, what this does is there are two ways, and this goes back to what we learned in micro originally. There are two ways in which money travels in, money travels out. This counts the money traveling out. This covers money spent. Okay, the other way of doing it is covering money earned, money coming into people. They equal each other. They're the same thing, okay? It's a very simple principle, okay? Money that is spent by one person becomes income to someone else. And that's what this is based on. You see the categories here. And it's important to remember the distinction in these categories. The first two categories in GDP accounting, and you see the overall formula here, and this is where we go into the categories. The first two categories deal with the private sector, okay? The first is consumption, private sector consumption of non-capital goods. Now, what we mean by non-capital goods, we defined this when we dealt with micro. A capital good is a good or service that is used in the production of something else, to produce something else. Okay, so consumption counts for private sector consumption of non-capital goods. So if I go out to a restaurant, the meal that I purchase or the meals that I purchase, okay, they count as consumption. All right, they're not being used for the production of anything else, and so they count as consumption. Now, the other category here is gross investment. All right, this is private sector consumption of capital goods, finished products that are used for productive purposes. Okay, it includes a couple of things here. All changes to inventories. Now, we didn't really talk that much in micro about inventories. I mentioned it, but we didn't really talk about it. If I produce something, okay, and it does not sell, that something becomes part of my inventory. Okay, if I produce 100 and sell 90, that means my inventory goes up by 10. All right, get me? Whereas if I sell more than I produce, if I produce 90 of them and sell 100, then the only way I can do that is by having an inventory. Okay, I sell off stuff that I previously made that I had in stock. Okay, so this includes, investment includes all changes to inventories. And so if the economy writ large produces a certain amount and it doesn't all get sold, it still gets counted. It gets counted, the surplus production gets counted as an increase in inventories. So too, if the overall economy doesn't produce as much as is sold, the reason it's able to do that is because it's selling off previous inventories. So we keep track of that. The other thing that's included is all construction, whether or not it's used for a productive purpose. So in terms of gross domestic product, someone building a new automobile service station, which is going to be used to fix cars and stuff like that, okay, is no different than somebody building a new house in which they're going to live. All construction is included as investment, okay? Now, we take a look here, and this is going to become important to us, all right? So pay attention. You have gross versus net investment. One of the defining features of capital equipment, okay, is capital equipment. We talked early on, or back in the first PowerPoint, okay, we talked about the idea of one of the characteristics of a capital good. Capital goods are durable, okay? What is true of any durable good is whenever you use a durable good is any good that can be used more than once in its intended use. When you use a durable good, a certain amount of the value of that good is expended in the use. Not all of it. Like with a consumable product, one of the different distinguishing features differentiating a consumable good from a durable good is that in a consumable good, 100% of its value is expended in the single use of it. With a durable good, that's not true. A certain percentage is used, okay? We refer to that percentage that's used by depreciation. You've all probably heard of depreciation. This is why they have, for example, the Kelley Blue Book on cars. The instant that you get in the car and start it up and drive it off the lot, it begins to depreciate. Literally, the way it works out is every time you get in your car and turn the engine on and drive it, a certain amount of the value is expended, okay? It depreciates, it drops in value. And so when we talk about it, there are two different types, all right? First type of investment is the replacement of depreciated capital. The other type is investment above and beyond the depreciation of capital. The investment above and beyond the depreciation of capital is net investment. Gross investment is larger because gross investment includes net investment, but also includes the replacement of the depreciated capital, okay? So you can have $1,000 of gross investment and $200 of net investment. What we can infer from that, what we would take away from that is that, okay, if I have $1,000 in gross investment and $200 in net investment, that means that my replacement of the depreciated capital is how much? $800, okay? 800 of that gross investment was just to replace worn out capital, okay? We pay attention to both. We pay attention to both, particularly when it gets to economic growth, and we'll see that when we get there. The third category is non-private sector, public sector purchases, and this is public sector purchases both of durable goods, investment goods, okay, and consumables. And so that for the private sector, we had consumption, C, and gross investment, I, with a subscript G. With government, all public purchases are lumped together. The C plus IG is lumped together for public purposes. Any use of public money, okay, counts as government services, provision of public goods. It does not, however, and this is important to understand, we want to explain this, okay, it does include things like defense spending, or highways, or police forces, or public services, public goods, all of which we'll get to. What it does not include is transfer payments, okay, what are often referred to as entitlements, okay, but in economic terms, what most people refer to with what the media and the pop culture refers to as entitlements, in economic terms, we refer to them as transfer payments, and we'll deal with them at some length, not terribly much, but a little bit. A transfer payment is any payment made for which no good or service is exchanged, okay? And so Social Security, welfare, unemployment compensation, these are all transfer payments. Transfer payments are not counted in the gross domestic product. They're not counted as government spending. And the reason for this is, again, to avoid double accounting. Think about it. If we make a transfer payment and give someone money, all right, we don't count that because that someone is now going to take that money and spend it on things. When it is spent on things, finished products, we count those finished products. So if we were to count the transfer payment plus count the finished product that they buy with that transfer payment, we'd be double accounting it. We'd be counting it twice. So we don't do that, okay? The final grouping, these are two, okay, in the gross domestic product accounting, is foreign factor income. And this becomes somewhat, what do I want to say, obtuse to people is, I guess, the best word for it. People sometimes have difficulty differentiating this. When we get to international economics, we'll talk about the distinction between current accounts and capital accounts. Current accounts, they measure the flow of goods and services between countries. Capital accounts, that measures the flow of money between countries. The two are not exactly the same. They're not exactly equivalent antecedents of one another, okay? When we deal with foreign factor income, that's what we start to get into, okay? And you see, first, you have the X. These are exports. All U.S.-owned assets purchased by foreign agents are assets, okay? M is all foreign-owned assets purchased by U.S. This is roughly equivalent to exports. This, roughly equivalent to imports. But once we get there, and this is, we'll look at this when we get to international economics more, but once we get there, we get into a problem, okay? Because not all U.S.-owned assets that are purchased by foreign agents or assets are goods, okay, or services. What we really want to look at here is money that comes into the country, which is the X, okay? So if you export goods, money comes into the country. That's money that's owed to the U.S., okay? So this is money owed to the U.S., or owed to us if we're any other GDP, okay? I just kind of used U.S. as an example. M is money that is owed to others. This is credit. This is debit. Simple enough to understand? So if this is greater than this, if X is greater than M, you run a surplus. That adds to your GDP. If X is less than M, then you run a deficit. That subtracts from your GDP. And that's currently, it's hard to avoid any news on this, but as you all know, the Trump administration has decided to make this one of their major issues that they're now addressing, is the current account deficit, the flow of goods and services, the current account deficit that the United States has with everybody, but mostly with the Chinese. Last year was in the neighborhood of 400 billion. We'll look at that when we get to international economics. and he wants to address this and correct it. And there's reasons for not doing that we'll get into again when we get to international economics. But at any rate, that's how you count it. All right. And here we see basically this is the real gross domestic product of the United States, and we'll deal with that in just a second. The difference between real gross domestic product and nominal gross domestic product. This is the real gross domestic product running from 2001 up to 2017. Macroeconomics gives itself the data. You see that the source of this data is the BEA, that counts as the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And for any quant jocks out there, for anybody that likes quantification and numbers, this is the greatest site on earth, okay, for all macroeconomic data. It's exceptionally easy to use. It's all free. It's all interactive data. You can get pretty much any table you want on anything. And so in macroeconomics, I make quite a lot of use of the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So this comes from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and you see now what this is this is the total consumption spending, which was our first. That's private sector purchase of non-capital goods, private sector purchase of capital goods, okay, government spending, the use of public money, and X minus M, okay. And so you see in 2017, we were just talking about, the deficit that the United States was running was $858.7 billion, all right. That was negative. That's 4.76% of the gross domestic product. And that's kind of what the Trump administration's come to the conclusion of is, well, wait a minute. If we turned that into a positive, then this would add to the gross domestic product. Yeah, it doesn't quite work out that way. And we'll get to that when we get there. But at any rate, you see that in 2017, consumption spending was 69.5% of all gross domestic product spending. Now, this will become relevant to us. Investment 17.71. And you see that percentage of consumption has consistently gone up since 2001. And basically, we'll explain this in greater detail when we get to economic growth. But the basic idea is that this consumption spending is really short-term macroeconomic growth. That's short-term macroeconomic. This is long-term macroeconomic, and we'll harken back to the production possibilities curve that we dealt with. And you see that government spending also has gone up, and this is as a percentage of the GDP. As a percentage of the GDP, it's actually gone down to 17.34. But at any rate, that's just kind of our first wash at the data, and that's what it looks like for the accounting of gross domestic product since 2001. This is the breakdown in chart form, just screwing around with Excel and things like that and coming up with charts. You see the vast majority of spending in the U.S. economy is consumption spending. That's private sector spending on non-capital goods. Then you have the investment, the government spending, which are roughly even to one another. And then this is below zero. This is your foreign factor. I mentioned the distinction between real and nominal accounting. We don't really pay very much attention to the nominal gross domestic product. We pay attention to the real gross domestic product. The difference between the two is very simple. Real adjusts for changes in price, which we'll come to call inflation, which we know is inflation, okay? Nominal does not adjust for this change in price. And you see here, this is why we use real gross domestic product. What we're interested in counting in gross domestic product, particularly in the growth of the gross domestic product, is the actual growth in output. If we include price changes in that, it clouds the issue, okay? So for example, if our total production is 10,000 units and the average price is $10, that's a gross domestic product of $100,000. If we have no growth in the production of units, okay, so it's still going to be the 10,000, but prices rise by 10%, that means you'll have your 10,000 units multiplied by your $11 price, and you'll have a gross domestic product of 110,000. Okay, so nominally the gross domestic product here has grown 10%, but in real terms, you're not producing anything more. So we pay very little attention to this. In fact, I pay no attention to nominal accounting. I pay attention to this, to real accounting. And that's what we'll focus our attention on. And this I mentioned at the outset, and I'll just amplify it a little bit here. In economics, okay, what we've talked about many times is that money flows in two and only two directions. Money flows in and money flows out, okay? The money that flows out from one economic agent flows in to another economic agent, all right? So if someone spends money, it becomes income to someone else. And this is why money at the level of the macroeconomy, money in equals money out. All right. It's balanced. This creates equilibrium. This is equilibrium Y. Y is the kind of term we in economics generally use for gross domestic product, probably because it's fewer letters. But so money spent becomes income to someone. So national income accounting, counting the income that people make, is going to get you to the same place as counting the output that they produce. Okay, and just think about that, just rest for a second and think about that money out from someone becomes money in for someone else. And that's why the two things balance, all right? And so the fact is I don't even trouble you with measuring, because it's much more complicated, measuring all of the various rents and all of the various incomes and all of the various wages that people make as part of the gross domestic product. It's going to get you to the same place. Okay, it gets you to the same number. So I track, and the Bureau of Economic Analysis, they track both, but it's much easier to track what we call the expenditures approach, which is how much money is spent. We'll move on to the idea of a business cycle, and we want to rest here for a minute in terms of business cycles. This is what a business cycle looks like. It has 4 stages. A growth stage, where everything is expanding, the peak, a recession, which I'm sure you've all heard of, and then the trough, which is the low point of the economy. And we see this is how it looks over time, okay? With each business cycle, the peak gets higher. This is why the peak, for the business cycle in 1930, and this is in real terms, in terms of real GDP, the peak in 1940 is way less than the peak in 2010. And it's a simple enough way to think about that. During the growth period, and we'll talk about all these periods, okay, during the growth period, everything's booming, everything's growing, incomes are rising, demand is going up. At the peak, everything levels off. Then at the recession, by definition, it's one of the things that bothers me with economics, particularly in an academic setting, is that they say, well, a recession is a reduction in spending. Okay, it's a reduction in output caused by a reduction in spending, but they don't ever explain why the reduction in spending takes place. We'll do that here. We'll explain why that takes place. Then the economy bottoms out at the trough, at which point it goes back up again, and that just kind of makes you see what business cycles look like. Right now, conventional wisdom is that we're right about here on the business cycle. We're on the late stage of a growth cycle. We're actually at the late stage of the longest growth cycle in U.S. history. This is from the data drawn from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which I then punched through Excel and came up with this nice little chart here. This is the business cycles in the United States since, as you see, 2006. Okay, the last recession that hit the U.S. prior to the Great Recession in 2008 and 2009 was a minor recession in 2001 that lasted for a couple of quarters. And so this is the end. This is the growth cycle, okay, that lasted roughly from 2000 and the last quarter of 2001 until really, if you look here, the fourth quarter of 2007, bounced up a little bit in the first quarter of 2008, and then collapsed. This is what has become known as the Great Recession. Okay, it's one of the largest. In terms of percentage of the gross domestic product, it's one of the largest dips in gross domestic product in U.S. history. It's the largest dip in gross domestic product since the Great Depression. Okay, and we'll get in a little bit to why this happened. That's not our purpose now. Our purpose now is just to look at what a business cycle looks like. And so what we see is what we talked about before, which is here's your growth cycle. You reach your peak right here, okay? Then you fall into a recession. It hits this trough, which it did in the second quarter of 2009, and then it rises back. And as I say, we're in this late stage, and you see that the peak at this growth cycle, okay, is greater than the peak at the last growth cycle. If you were to look before when it dipped in way back here in 2001, when it dipped for a couple of quarters, that peak was lower than the peak in 2007. So the peak keeps getting higher, which means that you're having some long-term economic growth. This is the result of the investment that we looked at in the gross domestic product accounting. That's the result of the investment, is that you're having some long-term economic growth. Okay, and so that's kind of what it looks like there, and that just gives you a real world example of what the business cycle looks like. And yes, it is true that the trough here dipped below the trough in the 2001 recession, because as I said, this was one of the largest downturns in U.S. history. And this just kind of goes over what we just talked about with the graph. The previous cycle lasted from the second quarter of 2001 until the end of 2007, with overall economic growth of 19.23%. That's not per year growth. That's overall growth. Okay, that's a 6-year period, give or take, 6.5 years. So you're averaging 3%, a little bit better than 3% every year. At the depth in the trough of the Great Recession, which was the second quarter of 2009, the gross domestic product had fallen 3.98% from the end of the 2007 peak, which, as I've mentioned, is the worst dip in the gross domestic product since the Second World War, actually since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Currently, since we came out of that, or since the U.S. came out of that recession, which it really started to do in the third quarter of 2009, the GDP has grown 23.33% in the longest growth cycle in U.S. history. And of course, the question we have, and there is no consensual agreement. Many people have asked this. I've asked many people. We all debate and discuss this. And if you ever watch, for example, Bloomberg television with all their analysts and things, there is no consensual agreement. How long will this growth continue? Most people, the consensual agreement is that we are at the latter stages of the growth cycle, but no one agrees as to how long those latter stages can go. Okay, could it be a year? Most people, conventional wisdom is that sometime in the next 18 months, the economy will experience a recession. But there's no, I mean, that's very speculative. We don't know when. Personally, my thoughts on it is it's going to come sooner rather than later, which is actually a good thing. Okay, one of the things that the Great Recession taught us is that a recession is an inevitability of the growth cycle, of the business cycle. It will happen. The question is when. Okay, and we'll deal with why it must happen. One of the things, okay, we'll deal with monetary policy when we get there, but just now, briefly, okay, Alan Greenspan was the head of the Federal Reserve from the late 80s until the early part of the 2000s, okay, when Ben Bernanke took over. Greenspan believed that through monetary policy and proper fiscal policy, you could make it so that there would never be a recession, okay? You could delay it indefinitely. As it works out, that's not true, okay? His belief in that and trying to accomplish that is the major cause of the Great Recession of 2008. One of the things that we see is the longer you delay that recession, the more severe it's going to be when it finally happens. And that's why I say it's better that it happened now than that we delay it and delay it and delay it and it happened later. Because if we do that, when it happens later, it's going to be more severe. It's going to last longer. It's going to be a greater dip. Correction has to happen, okay? All right, and we'll deal with that more. That really gets into fiscal and monetary policy a good bit. Moving on to the distinction, I mentioned the distinction between short-term and long-term economic growth, or short-term and long-term gross domestic product. Your actual gross domestic product is the amount that you're actually producing. Okay, that's largely based. I mean, there's investments in there, government spending's in there, the foreign factors are in there, but it's largely based on consumption. Potential gross domestic product, that's largely based on investment. Okay, one of the things that we look at, okay, and one of the things that as economists we debate is as investment spending, purely private sector investment spending, has been reduced as a percentage of the GDP. The result of that is that the potential gross domestic product, which is to say that upward trend of the peak of the business cycle that we've been talking about, becomes lower and lower because you're not getting enough. You're not expanding the potential GDP. Okay, and we'll look at that now in terms of our production possibilities curve. Now you hearken back with me. This is from the first PowerPoint lecture, right? This was our potential production curve, okay? And what this meant was that if you have two types of goods, consumer goods and military goods, what is typically referred to, the most famous example from economics is guns and butter, right? Guns and butter. This is the combination using all available resources, okay? All factors of production, all land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial ability. This is the maximum you can produce. You can produce any combination along these lines. And we asked about why it is that it's a curved line. Okay, it's a curved line because as you transfer goods out of the production of consumer goods into military goods, you get less and less bang for your buck. The first, you sacrifice very little and you get a great deal because the factors are very fungible. We won't return all the way back to that microeconomic discussion. Okay, and so the question always is to balance the spending for military goods, which largely comes from the government, from G, and the purchase of consumer goods, some of which are investment goods, okay, durable goods used in the production of something else. And so we balance between the two, and the question is, what balance is best for society, blah, 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 how should we devote our resources? To me, the question is very simple, and we deal with this when we deal with free trade. Free trade is going to allow the expansion of this production possibility curve. But to me, it's a very simple question. If we have the choice between building military goods or consumer goods or any combination along this line, what I'm going to do is devote every single resource I have to the production of military goods. Why? Because then I can take those military goods and take as many consumer goods as I like from my neighbor, right? Just go beat them up and take it. This was basically the idea. This was the beginning, for those of you who have ever studied U.S. History 1. This was the Jamestown colony's idea with the Powhatan Confederacy back in the early 17th century. It only works if you have an overwhelming superiority of the military goods. I should tell you that. That's how the Jamestown thing worked out. It works out. They fought a couple of. The first one was kind of a draw. The second one didn't go very well. They ended up bankrupt, and the Virginia Crown Colony was created. But at any rate, that's a subject for another thing. In fact, I have lectures up here as well on YouTube about U.S. History 1, which is another thing that I teach. I teach U.S. 1 and U.S. 2, and that's included in the U.S. 1. So again, this just harkens us back to the first lecture and the idea of the production possibility curve, now writ large at the level of macro. And so when we deal with actual production, we're dealing with this area in here up to the PPC. All right. Typically, the gross domestic product that you're actually producing is somewhere in this area at this actual production level. How you can tell that, we'll deal with this when we get to unemployment. We'll deal with what's called the natural rate of unemployment. The natural rate of unemployment is the total level of employment given that you're using every available resource. In the United States, they figure it's somewhere between 3 and 5%. But as you use more and more of your resources, okay, you utilize them more efficiently and effectively, you get closer and closer to your production possibility curve, okay? And so right now, you're at this level, okay? That's unused capacity. How do you know that it's in that level? You know it's in level, for example, at that level because, for example, last month in December of this is now we're recording this in January of 2019. In December of 2018, 312,000 private non-farm payroll jobs were created. That means you're not using all your available capital equipment. If you can hire people, that means you're not using all your available capital equipment, which means you're pushing towards the production possibility curve. And again, the question that economists have is how far until you reach this? What is the actual curve here? We don't know. Okay, it's surprising everyone. It's astonishing to everyone that the unemployment level is now down just over 3%. Most economists guessed that the natural rate of unemployment would be in the neighborhood of 4 to 4.25%. And so when it dipped below 4%, people were surprised. And with the numbers from last month, people are just absolutely shocked that there are still jobs to be had out there. That's one of the indications that you're still in the growth cycle. It's that jobs are still being created. And that's why everyone's predicting that this has got to end soon. I mean, there can't be that many more jobs given the total level of capital in the economy, which is another thing we'll take a look at. Looking at the stages of the business cycle itself, okay, and I'll explain my shorthand. It's fairly intuitive. This shorthand is fairly intuitive. This is what's referred to as the growth cycle, okay? Real income, and we'll explain what that is in a minute when we get to our discussion of the wage-price ratio. Real income goes up. Now, hearken back with me to PowerPoint 1.2. Okay, one of the things about economics, this is one of the things I like about economics, is it's a logical argument. One point builds on a previous point. But if you hearken back to lecture 1.2, PowerPoint 1.2, one of the things we said is, okay, when it comes to demand, there are certain determinants. This is when we got into the idea of how does the demand curve shift. Well, one of the big things determining shifts in the demand curve was the level of income. Okay, it's what I refer to as the drunken sailor on leave phenomenon. If people have more money in their pocket, they're going to spend it. All right, and so as real income levels go up, people demand more. Okay, this is the quantity demanded of X going up. Because they demand more, producers have to supply more. Because producers have to supply more, they need more laborers. They need more workers. Okay, because they need more workers, the demand for labor goes up, and therefore wages go up. Because wages go up, real income goes up. Because real income goes up, they demand more. Because demand more, they demand more. Producers will have to supply more. Because producers have to supply more, they're going to need more laborers. Because they need more laborers, demand for labor goes up and wages go up, and therefore income goes up, and the cycle just perpetuates itself. Okay? The question, of course, is why does it then not perpetuate itself indefinitely? The reason it doesn't perpetuate itself indefinitely is because of something we haven't talked about, which is inflation, changes in prices. We'll get there. Okay? That's why it doesn't perpetuate itself indefinitely. The peak is when the economy is at the maximum output. Potential GDP, actual GDP are the same thing. This is when you're producing on your production possibility curve, okay? Or as close to the production possibility curve as you're going to get it until the recession is triggered, until the phenomenon that triggers the recession happens. This is why I just mentioned the natural rate of unemployment is the percentage of jobless with all capital resources in use. In the United States, the estimate is somewhere between 3 and 5%, okay? And with the job numbers recently created 312,000 jobs. That's non-farm private sector jobs. Clearly, we haven't hit the natural rate of unemployment yet. The recessionary cycle, okay, also known as the debt cycle, is the exact opposite of the growth cycle. Real income drops. Because it drops, people stop spending money. Remember, income is one of our major sources of a shift in the demand curve. That's true of the aggregate demand curve as well as an individual demand curve. Okay, so real income goes down, so they demand less. Because they demand less, producers need to produce less. Because they need to produce less, they don't need as many laborers. Because the demand for labor shifts inward, okay, they need less laborers, so wages go down. Because wages go down, incomes go down. Because incomes go down, people demand less. Because people demand less, Producers supply less because producers supply less. They don't need as many laborers because they don't need as many laborers. And there's an inward shift of the labor curve or the demand curve for labor. Then wages go down, incomes go down, and the cycle repeats itself and perpetuates. And this is one of the big debates. We'll get to the discussion of Keynesian economics is presumably, okay, without any intervening force, this growth cycle would go on indefinitely. So too with the debt cycle. With no intervening force, this will go on indefinitely. This is what leads to Keynesian economics, which we'll cover in not in great detail, but in some detail, and explain what is meant. Is that there needs to be something intervening here to stop this cycle. At any stage of this cycle, if you change any of these factors, it should reverse the cycle. Okay. For example, with Reagan, the Reagan administration tried this supply side economics where they cut the costs for producers. That should lead to an increase in supply, which would lead to an increase in demand for labor and an increase in wages and an increase in income and trigger the growth cycle. Didn't quite work out that way. On paper it did. In practice it didn't. Okay. And we'll deal with that when we get to the recessions here in just a second. And then you have the trough. Okay. This is the low point of the economy, where incomes are at their lowest, demand is at its lowest, supply is at its lowest, the demand for labor is at its lowest. Okay, it's exact opposite of the peak. Okay, so that you're as far away from the natural rate of unemployment here as you are close to it here. You're as far away here from potential GDP as you are close to it here. Okay,